Let me just read you some excerpts from the class discussion. This might get nauseating, but stay with me here. I want to give you just 4 snippets from the class. Example 1. This is on the meaning of words, with the minister saying that logic is irrelevant. We were talking about Jesus' baptism, where a voice comes from the clouds, you know that scene? This is my beloved son, etc., which is used to argue that Jesus is divine. So I said, yes, but he's not fully, it's sort of lengthy, but you'll see how this develops. Yes, but he's not fully God until we get to John. When they're calling him the Son of God, they're using Jewish language that refers to the Jewish people, the Jewish rulers. It's a very common term. It does not refer to divinity. When the Jews called someone Son of God, they said, you are a fellow Jew, and we are all sons of God. This is me talking in class. In the genealogy of Jesus that Luke presents, we end up with son of Adam, who is the Son of God. Now, nobody's saying Adam is divine, and yet he's called the Son of God. It's not an extraordinary term. The Jews call themselves children of God, and in fact in Psalm 2, you have King David reporting that the Lord said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. This is just how the Jews thought of themselves, and the ruler, in this case David, was the Son of God. That's just written in the Psalms. And then Mike says, this is the language of the Nicene Creed. This was the language of the Council of Nicaea, used in order to make the case for the fact that Jesus was divine. He was begotten, not made, very God of very God. When David said begotten, not made, that's not the Nicene Creed. We're not in the Old Testament now, but it's the same language in the Old Testament. It's not the same language. It may be the same words. You are my son, today I have begotten you. That's in the... This is a whole different theology. This is a theology, as I've just said, this is beginning to evolve away from the Old Testament to the New Testament Messiah. What's at stake here is not whether Jesus was divine, but whether Jesus was the Messiah. It's only as we look back with our own theology, but the writers of the Gospel didn't see it that way. And then another student says, if Matthew saw Jesus as only human, then what is all this we just read? This is my beloved son. That's Matthew. But that's also the language of the Old Testament, because we have that David. I spoke very softly in this class. We have that David is already referred to as the Son of God. That was just the language, and that was not a divine reference. The Jews were horrified at the notion that a human being could be divine. That was totally repulsive to them. So when they're talking about a Messiah, they're talking about a figure, a leader in the model of David. They were not talking about a human being divine. And then very interestingly, another student talked to me. He addressed me directly. He said to me, he said, Catherine, take me back just a second and concisely tell me what it is exactly that you were challenging Mike, the minister, on. He said that Satan was tempting Jesus as both fully man and fully God, and your contention was that this doesn't make sense from a literary perspective, that someone fully God cannot be tempted. And I said, yes, that's my first point, that you cannot have Satan tempting God. By definition, God is not something that is tempted. That's just absurd to create a scene like that.
Can you hear her okay back there? Okay, just checking. Okay, go ahead.
And then the minister says, why do you persist applying logic to theology? And I said, because we're talking about words. No, we're talking about theology, and we're talking about faith, and you're mincing words about what makes sense, and words in the Old Testament that have little truck with what we're reading here. We're talking about theology, and we're talking about the whole idea that whether it makes sense or not, nonetheless, we have received 2,000 years of Christian theologizing, that Jesus was fully God and fully man. I don't care whether or not you acknowledge the fact that this makes sense or not. That's what we have to work with, and that's what we're looking at here. This gives you an idea of the level of the discussion. So this is just 4 months into the class, and he's already getting frazzled. Example 2, very short. The minister patted, because these are all very educated people, and he's this doctor of divinity. So he padded his talk about something called atonement theology, with a reference to Kant, Hegel, and Schleiermacher. It was just name dropping. And the next week in my printout, I included quotes from these guys, from these philosophers, and all of the quotes were, of course, derogatory about religion, but nobody noticed. Example 3. In February, I raised the question of Jesus' originality. Turns out the Son of God, who is God himself, does not have to be original. Obedience is what matters. So I said, last time you were very emphatic in stating that there is much in Jesus that is not original. He said, what, I emphatic? No, theatrical. You were emphatic in stating that there is much in Jesus that is not original. Yes, I was emphatic about that. So, third time, there is much in Jesus' teaching that is not original. What is original in Jesus' teachings? Is there anything that is original? Mike says, the minister says, well, you're right, yes there are. I could not answer that question in 2 minutes. I'm not sure I could answer that question to your satisfaction in 30 minutes. Let's just say this. There are scholars who believe there are sayings that came from the lips of Jesus. But are they original? By original, I mean an original idea, a new wisdom, a new insight. Not a repetition of, I don't know how to answer that question. Do you think that that's an important thing to think about? No, not really. Our faith is not based on Jesus' originality. Our faith is based on Jesus' obedience. Jesus' obedience? Jesus' obedience and his faithfulness to God. Our faith is based on the life that Jesus lived, blah, 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 blah. And so I don't think that's an issue. It's one that would be difficult to prove one way or the other. How could I possibly go back, unless I'm just a really well-informed scholar of classical Jewish thought or classical Near Eastern thought, to be able to say that this is an original thought of Jesus, because I haven't found it anywhere else in any of the books that I've been reading, and even then, how could I be sure? But that's simply not a piece, at least, that I base my faith on. It doesn't matter whether Jesus was original. It's hard for me to read this without making faces. It matters that he was true to what he said, that he lived the life that he preached about and modeled it for us, and that he was obedient to God and unto death. And that's what feeds my faith. We gotta go. So this is how he concluded the class. We gotta go. He was getting rough, and I knew this couldn't go on much longer. Example 4, very short. During the last class, the subject was the fact that the apocalypticists, and Jesus is described in the Gospels as an apocalypticist, believed that the end of the world was imminent, and only the pure would be saved, and everybody else would perish in a painful death. It's the us, them. This is where Mike loses it. His next move after this class is to cancel the class. So I said, do you know of any religion or spiritual tradition that doesn't make that distinction between us and them? Very few. Can you name them? Probably one or more of the Eastern religions. would they be superior because they are inclusive? What are you trying to lead me to say here? I'm asking you. No, you're not. You're asking leading questions. I'm asking. Do you have a point here? I'm asking you, is it superior to regard humanity as a unit rather than as something that falls into us and them? Is that a more advanced form of spirituality? Mike then goes on to chat at length about the kingdom of God. By the way, the voice that I'm giving here to him is not really how he spoke. He spoke in this very self-assured, he's a portly man, in this very self-assured, sort of wonderful, round way. So he never really actually raised his voice, but in order to show where my voice is and his is, I had to make him hear. So he goes into this sort of regular thing that he knows how to do about the kingdom of God. And one student says, spirituality is about overcoming our selfish natures. It becomes a lengthy discussion. People talk about selfishness being natural, that it's natural to hate people who are not like you. Mike says, it was natural for Jesus, this is the minister, he says it was natural for Jesus to share his culture's xenophobia and to call the Canaanites dogs. People in the class cited examples of how different cultures and religions refer to those who are other. So it becomes an engaged, lively discussion. And finally someone named Frank makes the point that we need to overcome our selfishness, and that's what spirituality is about. And the minister concludes, Frank has just given us a new definition for the kingdom of God. It's 9 o'clock, and I'm going to say the heck with it. That was the last class in early March, after just 5.5 months. He could not sustain this level of discussion. It wasn't just me. What scared him, I think, was that the others were finding the courage to think outside the Bible and to ask harder questions.